Anyway, good evening and welcome. Welcome if you're joining us here on the campus of Pacific School of Religion, or if you're joining us online. If you're joining us tonight at this moment as we are alive and glad to be able to be in person with one another or online, or if you're joining us watching this a couple of months from now, a couple of years from now. It is great to be able to be together. One of the things that to me has been really significant about the impact of the pandemic on much of our life together is the fact that it messes with the two elements of the theory of relativity, time and space. And so it's understandable that in many ways, since the pandemic time, we are still finding ourselves somewhat disoriented, because as the theory of relativity indicates, the way we organize our sense of self is often based on both time and space. We are living through a time of lots of disruptions, not only of our concepts and ideas, but of our institutions and our life together. Over the last couple of weeks, we have been engaging particularly two themes that are really intertwined and significant, but often not engaged with one another: disruptive artificial intelligence, Christian nationalism, and democracy. My name is Vásquez-Levy. I serve as president here at Pacific School of Religion. It is great to have you all with us here tonight, both in person and online. It's been fun to reconnect with some of you who are PSR alums, and to have with us Reese Potterville, one of my predecessors here as president at PSR, to have some of our alums with us, friends from many years to the community. So thank you and welcome as we are here tonight to continue our reflection. As we gather today in what's been a four-part series, this is the last of this particular series. This series is part of the Earl lectures that started in 1901. It's one of the longest running series in California. And this is one of the first times that we are returning to doing them in person, and in this case also hybrid. For more than 100 years, PSR has hosted the Earl Lectures and Leadership Conference, addressing critical theological, pastoral, and social issues of the day. Part of our engagement around the Earl Lectures and many of our other programs at PSR are seeking to engage publicly in conversations about religion, theology, and other disciplinary areas that shape our lives. One of the terms I've appreciated in the series is the idea that artificial intelligence is a keystone technology. And this is from John, our presenter, will introduce in a second. It's a keystone technology because it impacts pretty much every aspect of our lives. Religion is a keystone technology. It shapes many of the aspects of our understanding of birth, of death, of life, of relationship, of duty, of responsibility, of accountability. And so part of our conversation in bringing these two technologies together is to think about the ways that they can be certainly used for good and for advancing the well-being of community, but they can also easily, regrettably, be utilized for the ill and destruction and the damaging of community. And so tonight we focus our conversation on leadership. How do we make that shift? And how do we ensure or work together collaboratively towards ensuring that the well-being of communities are served by the technologies we engage? Our presenter throughout this four-part series has been John Robichaux, who is Executive Director of the Fung Institute for Engineering Leadership at the University of California, Berkeley's College of Engineering, which is one of the organizations that is on our campus as well, and we are delighted to have John with us. He is an award-winning executive, educator, and consultant for more than 25 years. He has advised, trained, and consulted for hundreds of learning organizations in industry, government, and civil society. We are delighted to have him with us tonight. So please, and I'll introduce you just in a second. I just wanted to give a round of applause for him initially, and I'll say one more thing. There is a longer introduction in your bulletin as well that I invite you to take a look at as well for John. And I mentioned in an earlier discussion that this year, in 2024, 60% of the world's population is electing a new leader. 60% of the world's population is participating in some democratic process in the election of a new leader. Those choices of leadership are not only, and increasingly so in the world, between two individuals, as is the case in the United States as we go into the fall, but oftentimes a choice between two worldviews that are increasingly polarized. So our conversation tonight, as we think about keystone technologies, the things we have been hearing about, the models of democracy, how do we measure the harm and the possibility of artificial intelligence? How do we maintain a presence and critical but also appreciative engagement with religion? How do we negotiate claims of truth and perceptions of truth? All of these conversations, in part, lead to the discussion about the role of leadership in such a critical time. And so one of the partnerships that we have here on our campus is that both PSR and the Fung Institute are focused on the preparation of leaders for the transformation of the communities towards the good. So again, this time, yes, please help me to welcome back.
Thank you so much. First lesson, leadership starts and stops, just like that. I'm particularly grateful to be here tonight to talk on this topic and to have President Vásquez-Levy as respondent. As he flagged, both in my current role, I think a lot of leadership, but also as a member of the PSR campus community, he and I engage in many different types of conversations around what leadership could mean, might mean, can mean, does, and what we can do together and individually as institutions to advance a real revitalized vision of what it is to be a leader in today's world. So looking forward to the conversation as well. Okay, by way of prepared remarks, as always, reminding folks, I don't speak for Berkeley or the Institute tonight in my personal capacity. The flow looks like this. It's a brief look back at prior sessions for those who may be joining us for the first time or missed anything. I hopefully will level set for you. Leadership at our moment of history, I'll ask this question that I sometimes get asked, and I'll tell you why. When the time comes, does leadership matter? And then a few closing thoughts to the series on AI, democracy, and religion, each as keystone technologies. David took my thunder on that one. And then my final takeaways for the series. I'm looking forward to the Q&A, which should take up the latter two-thirds of the conversation tonight. So looking forward to that as well. Okay, so looking back at these prior sessions. Firstly, in the first session, I gave an overview of AI and religion, but throughout the whole series, and I counted, we have mentioned approximately 100 different examples of how AI could be engaging within religion just with the current and perceivable AI technologies that exist today. My actual count was 95. So if you missed any of that, I do invite you to go back, especially that first session. There's a lot there. Many of those examples, as I've underscored several times in the conversations, are life-giving, life-saving, really supporting human, individual, communal flourishing, and then of course plenty for us to worry about as well. Okay, on the nationalism front, we've talked about how AI is really giving us the potential to add fuel to an existing fire around the rise of modern Christian nationalism. We saw it in the film that was screened, but also in the conversation led by Dean Abraham, that there are strategies in the US and elsewhere to lift up religious nationalisms of a variety of types. I went last session, the democracy session, talking about some of the powerful, but also some of the distorted narratives around nationalism that are really powerful, that we sometimes hear. I also want to underscore that some of the conversation throughout the series has focused on religious nationalism variants that are anti-democratic, including the Blind Faith documentary in particular. But I've also sort of stretched that here and remind us that there are types and variants of Christian or other types of religious nationalism that are built on truly democratic views as well. So go back to the third session last time and you'll see the conversations around majoritarianism and communitarianism, where nationalism is not always in opposition to democracy, but actually pulls on some real live threads that exist in the broader democratic discourse and models that exist out there. And then just a reminder that religious nationalisms are in fact generally religious in their nature. Last time, on the democracy front, I offered what I propose as a principled approach to both finding ways to include and exclude religious arguments in a pluralist democracy, how to navigate between the arguments of King and the KKK. The proposal, broadly speaking, is that we're seeking greatest freedom possible for religious choice within the bounds of equality in a pluralist democratic society, and that does exclude some religious individuals and communities, terrorists, nationalists, communitarians, and the like, from accessing the coercive power of the state, and, in theory, empowers a much wider range of democratic discourse. I made a proposal to include religious conversations, religious proposals, religious language in that broader view of democracy, which goes beyond the class liberal view of democracy, which will often exclude religious thoughts, practices, and legitimate contributions. So tonight, talking about leadership. Why leadership? Firstly, part of it's biographical. If you did bother to read the longer biography in the program, you will notice it is a strange journey that I have been on throughout my career, teaching religion and politics at Harvard, at Stanford, making a move because of the study of ethics of war into AI about 15 years ago, leading leadership programs at Stanford and Columbia, then in the AI space going forward, and convening this broad range of disciplinary conversations throughout. But the common theme has always been, what do leaders, people who are who are in formal leadership positions, and those of us who are citizens who want to have an active and contributing role to society for the better, so view ourselves as citizen leaders, what do we need to know about the hot topics of the day? And if you look across, in my case, 25 years, you're talking about immigration, refugee policy, you're talking about human rights, you're talking about religion and war, you're talking about AI, and a variety of fronts as well. So for me, leadership is the thing that ties together both my career and the thing, as you'll see tonight, that I think is most needed at this moment in history, around AI, around democracy, and then I'll ask David about the question of religion as well. Okay, so it's a historic moment of responsibility. My view fundamentally around AI, and every time I talk to an audience about AI today, is that we who are alive today, we in this room, we who are watching, we are the generation that's going to be able to set the path for the initial stages of this age of AI. Again, AI has been around for a long time, but the boom, the moment that we will define this age of AI is now. And the choices that we make, it's not that they're irrevocable, it's not that they won't be revised by future generations, but we get to set the agenda in ways that no other generation in history is going to have the opportunity to do. So for me, and I hope for you, you take that responsibility seriously, if it's of interest to you, but for all of us, it is a fundamental responsibility that we have to the future of the world. Related to that, democracy as well. So democracy, as you know, is in a weakened moment, and it's on retreat by many metrics around the world, not just in the United States. And so the choices that we're making today, not just in the election in a couple of weeks, but also over now, for those of you who have ballots already, and going ahead, the choices that we make are impactful, again, in a way that other generations, other moments in history just don't always offer us. And so really an outsized impact here. I'm going to ask David to think about, can we say the same about religion at a moment when, in the United States we see some decline in religion, there's a question of religious progressives, religious left, and the like. I wonder if it's also an outsized moment for religious leaders. So that's the question there. Okay. We have talked about some legitimate headwinds. So on the AI front, In particular, with the conversation last week with Professor McMahon, we emphasized that the AI technology is at the cutting edge right now. So most advanced AIs are going to be shaped and are limited to only a few types of for-profit companies who have access to the ability to create most cutting-edge AIs. And so the question that Professor McMahon asked us is, hey, look, that's market-driven. There's some real forces there. That seems like a worry. I described the story how my Stanford team and I worked very much on this idea of trying to open up other avenues for public interest AI, for beneficial AI, for planting seeds on the technologist side of things so that the best of AI can come and find root and can grow in the soil that, is baked by market resources. What I want to add today is also to remind us that if there are places where we're going to be nervous by the market incentives that drive AI today, there are also good things that will come from the market forces that are driving AI. So a lot of the technologies in healthcare and education and the like are going to be built by companies and individuals who are driven by those market forces. So I don't want anybody leaving the series thinking that's all bad news. And I think we did a good job of highlighting sort of the dangers at one end, but also the need to build a beneficial AI ecosystem and set of technologists who are thinking not just about market resources, but also about how AI can be beneficial, broadly speaking. So there's another bucket there I wanted to make sure to emphasize here. On the democracy front, last week I talked about that we're not only having this retreat of democracy that is referenced, but we also have structures of democracy that will allow for a range of interpretations of what the democratic arrangement should be, majoritarian, communitarian, and pluralist. The headwind there is that the systems and the checks and balances for minority protections, or that will exclude nationalists, they're not always the most robust. So we have real headwinds and opportunities here for people to take advantage. The term I used last week was hacking the system. Religion, plenty of examples I'm not even going to give you, but you know that the nationalist example is one of them, where they're able to step into a space and make alliances in public sphere, in the public arena in a way that is a headwind for folks who don't think the nationalists should have the power of the state at the end of the day. So all legitimate concerns that we've already discussed, and adding a little bit more color to here today. And I want you to absolutely walk away from the series knowing that there's incredible good to be done on the constellation that AI is allowing us to open up on a number of fronts. The engagement of AI and religion, which was the topic of that first session. The engagement of AI and democracy, real opportunities there. There is, in our work, the potential to have transformative impact for good in this constellation of AI, religion, and democracy. So, fundamental challenges for leadership. Some of this you may have. I'm not going to take you through a leadership course, but I want to flag a couple that are particularly important in my mind, at least in quick order, for that constellation of AI, democracy, and religion, before moving into, I think, some unique challenges for this moment in history. So quickly, honest assessments. I hope that you have heard throughout the series both an excitement about the possibilities of AI and concerns about it. I hope that I've given you, if you were at one end of that spectrum, a sense of our conversations are giving you a sense that maybe there's something to, maybe the more excited end of the spectrum, the more worried end of the spectrum. But whatever it is, as a leader, we have to be looking at hard truths and honest assessments. One of the things then that I emphasize with leaders, no matter where they are, whether they're just getting started or whether they're prime ministers and Nobel laureates and like, is that there are many roads to success in leadership. Wherever you are in the world, whether you hold an official position or not, you can have leadership roles, and that can happen
You can find success through a variety of means. My hope for each of us who want to take up a mantle of leadership is to ask the question, what are our fundamental values in that role? How do we identify them? How do we communicate them, etc.? That's absolutely essential as we live through this critical moment in history on each of the fronts I just flagged. Sometimes folks want to think about AI and ethics, and that's a good thing. When I teach my course in AI and ethics, I have about 20 different topics. Many times I come across leaders of organizations who are worried, thinking that this AI business is so new they don't know what to do on the ethical front. And when you actually sit down and walk people through some of the questions that AI technologists have to deal with, what comes to the fore is that a lot of the questions that AI is raising on the ethical side, as in the leadership side, are actually questions we already are asking on other fronts. So if you're a leader of an organization, or if you're worried about the transformative nature of AI, I want to tell you, and I constantly tell leaders, that actually a lot of what you need to meet this moment, you already have. So one example I like to give, it's an example that was in the conglomeration of some stories that were in the news the past 7 years or so, on a recommendation around, say, recommendation engines to help decide if an inmate should be given parole. And there were times where we found that some of the models that were being used were biased either for or against a given racial or ethnic group. And so the question that the technologists brought to the decision makers was, hey, look, I'll be happy to throttle this model to meet the outcomes or the desires that you want. I can solve for the problem you want, but what's the problem you want to solve for? That's not a technical problem. That's an ethical problem. That's a leadership problem. Am I going to engage, to use the rights language, in equal treatment of the data, even if it creates disparate outcomes? Am I going to aim for more equal outcomes, even if it means disparate treatment? Those of you in the civil rights world and the human rights world will recognize that language. It's a very old debate. In the US, we sometimes divide along political party lines to answer that. But it's an ethical question. It's a leadership question. It's not always, in fact, in most cases, it's not primarily a technological question. Okay, last session, and I've already emphasized that I would like, when I emphasize the democratic ethos, for increasing freedom, equality, lifting up folks, creating opportunity, emphasizing protection of minors and other directing this. This is me thinking with leaders about, hey, look, we're in a democratic society. There are maybe some ethical, or maybe there's some underlying principles here that we want to hold up. And these are not the principles that I'm necessarily emphasizing were I to be giving leadership trainings for an authoritarian regime, which I'm not. But I think we have tools in the democratic ethos that we can pull as we think about what are the AIs we want to build, what are the use cases, what are the concerns, how do I want to deploy, what values do I want to underline my choices around AI, around democracy, and then religious uses. And then religion, of course, contributions and dangerous threat. So if that's sort of a fundamental set underlying some of the AI democracy religion constellation, there are a few that I think about as unique or maybe even more important in this moment in history. So first is the centrality of judgment for wisdom. And actually, I think so far, one of the best comments about leadership made in the series was not made about leadership. It was made by Dean Abraham when she was talking about relationality and how we can organize around our communities around a legalistic view of relationship with rules and principles that are pretty clearly defined and ins and outs. Or we can take a covenantal approach where we're in this together, where the relationship matters, where not everything is written down. And so for leaders, I often am reminding them that, so that's my variance, moving her comments. You can go re-see her comments in session 2 if you need to remind us how she used the term. But for us, for me, on leadership, I think this is really important because when I talk to policymakers about what's going to happen for AI regulation right now, what we find is there's a whole lot of proposals, but not a lot getting through. That the field of what we're going to be doing with AI, the options that are going to be available to us, are going to be enormous, at least for the foreseeable future. The same, when I describe the systems and the structures of democracy, which will allow for the majoritarian or the communitarian or the pluralist to step into that space. And so the commitment, the covenantal relationship that we have as leaders, about how we're going to use that expansive opportunity space, where we could do harm and we could do good. Those are choices that we make as leaders. And so the choice of judgment is absolutely essential. And whether you like him or not, one of the lessons of the Trump years has been, if you rely on legalism alone, and then you have somebody who's willing to go up to that line and maybe even cross it, you can see, I hope, if that's the type of thing that worries you, where judgment, where wisdom, where restraint is an essential feature of leadership in this moment, where our democratic structures and our AI regulations really are going to allow for a lot of opportunities. Good, bad, ugly, and otherwise. And so the leadership task is to live in that relational, covenantal relationship, to have the values that are going to lift up freedom and opportunity along the way. Okay, the democratic values here reaching across boundaries. This is absolutely essential because right now we have an expertise. We live in a world where expertise is often diffuse and separated. What you're an expert in is not what I'm an expert in. It's one of the reasons I love working with the PSR community and with President Vásquez-Levy. And I think it's one of the reasons that I'm here today, and you just said it, right? Is because the conversations that are most important for today require us to be thinking across disciplines and boundaries in a way that, because expertise is so diffuse, may not have been as critical in the past. And so for the moment, I think that's absolutely essential. In a second, I'll show you a list of what that has looked like for me in the AI space. And then multi-generational. I made a reference to this, I think, in one of the earlier sessions. That the idea that when we get together, we're not just reaching across boundaries of expertise, but being able to talk across generations is one of those great things about leadership that really gets me excited. It's one of the things I love working in this space. So, and it's one of the things that the PSR community has really looked to make on this campus as they're thinking about how to re-envision a campus with a middle school, with people of all ages and going through the PSR programs, with graduate and undergraduate students going through our programs as well. Okay, in the AI space, this is just a simple list of the disciplines in which, or the areas in which I've been engaged in conversation over the past 15 years, much of this being rehashed again over the past 3 years since the ChatGPT moment, a couple years ago here, and just before. But just to give you an idea, when I'm talking about AI in the world and what its possibilities are, I'm thinking about many of these disciplinary areas of expertise and infusing them in the conversations that we have here this month, in this series. And the feedback that you give in the conversation that we have are things I'm going to take to the next set of leaders here, to policymakers, to executives. And that, I hope, I'm not saying I'm doing everything right, but this is the type of thing that I hope is what we are able to do as leaders in this moment where we've got a new keystone technology that's going to impact so many areas, and we're all trying to figure it out together. And so whether it's a question of religion, whether it's a question of democracy, whether it's a question of AI, you could be talking to people in any one of these fields or more. And that, to me, is the type of leadership that I also want us to be thinking about. Where are the places where we can learn from each other and we can we can address problems. In the first session, I gave you a couple of surprise examples that because of these conversations, we were able to change the way we thought about policy. We were able to change the way we thought about ethics as well. So it's a multidisciplinary world. Now, this is a lesson I learned from AI technologists. I have multiple times throughout the series talked about AI as a tool. And they love to point out that the AI hammer is great with nail problems, but not with screw problems or saw problems and the like. So, Professor McMahon last time was joking during the Q&A that at some points it felt like maybe we were asking AI to solve all the problems of the world. And I think, for me, I want us to walk away with a clear sense that AI has got limitations, but it is only a tool. And it's not going to be the panacea that we hope to solve every problem. It won't be the tool you pull out of your toolkit for every problem. Okay, so does leadership really matter? For many people, the answer is an obvious duh. Of course it does. But there are a couple of responses sometimes I get about, maybe it doesn't. So maybe systems or structures, this is a good argument sometimes from our more progressive friends, are in place that doesn't really matter who's in leadership, on the one hand. On the other hand, hey, leadership, is that really just a reflection of the society and the people involved? I think leadership matters, and I'm going to give you 3 examples why, hopefully, quickly. The first is recent US politics. Here again, the past 10 years or so, since coming down the escalator, if you had told me before that escalator that the Republican Party in the United States would not be emphasizing the importance of allies on the international scale, or would not be emphasizing law or communitarian, or a variety of other things, would not be emphasizing the importance of allies and small budgets and things like this, nobody would have believed it, right? So in the past 10 years, we have all lived through a world in which leadership mattered in that decade. Totally transformed the way US politics functions. Religious beliefs, tons of examples throughout history. The canonical example I like to use is Latter-day Saints community and polygamy, and how there was a negotiation behind the scenes that if Utah is going to become a state, the religious belief needed to change on that. And there are plenty of other examples we could pull from religious history. Leadership choices mattered to what were perceived by some to be poor religious beliefs. You can change your politics, you can change your beliefs, even religious ones. On the AI front, often talk about example of colleagues of mine who are trying to help hospitals reduce deaths by deaths from folks that acquired infections in the hospital. Kills more people in the United States than car accidents do in a given year. And they had designed this beautiful experiment. You would have loved it, I promise. But they chose, before deploying their experiment, to go into the hospital and talk to the stakeholders, the nurses, the care technicians on the hospital floor. And the nurses and the caretakers had all kinds of problems with the beautifully designed experiment. And the researchers had a question. What happened? They took the time to learn what the concerns were. They redesigned the project to address questions of privacy, to address questions of cybersecurity, to still work to try and save the lives that might have been taken through hospital-acquired infections, but completely redesign their research or their tools in the AI front. But because they had the conversations with the key stakeholders in that context, they completely revised the approach that they took. That's a leadership problem. That's not a technical problem. Either one of those, the original beautifully designed project, research project, or the revised version, would have gotten them the data they needed to determine if this was, if their preferred solution was going to work or not in this hospital context. but because the leadership of that research team said it matters that we invest, that we're engaged with those who are most invested in our solutions, our technical solutions. We're going to take the time, we're going to go back to the drawing board, we're going to repurpose we're going to redesign our entire project, and that project ended up being extraordinarily successful, and now sets the standard in many hospitals around the country. Leadership can transform politics, can transform even religious beliefs, and the way we employ or design our best or most exciting technologies in the world too. Leadership does matter. AI creates an interesting problem though. So here's a classic story that I teach around AI leadership. And I hope too it's going to contextualize for us a little bit more about what's needed beyond AI. So on the right, got an image here of a missile battery system. And this is the story I'm about to tell is not AI specific, and it goes around through leadership curricula, business schools and elsewhere, military and elsewhere, in various forms. I won't give you the whole story, I'll give you a web version of it. So you may have encountered this elsewhere, but here's the summary version I'll give today. There's a leader in the military who's responsible for determining if they're going to engage in active military action, launching a missile that could result in the lives of many people being lost. And as part of the role, they rely on a computer system which gives recommendations about whether to fire or not. Now that's really important in the military context because seconds matter. In the story, in the canonical story, the leader sees something that he does not think is accurate, and despite the fact that the computer is telling him to fire, chooses not to. Turns out, the leader was right. Gets commendations, medals, and is now a storyteller in a business school leadership course in the world. On the left side of the screen is the Chinese game Go. You may remember a few years ago when AI finally beat the world masters in Go. What you may not have heard is about the subsequent analysis of how the AI did it. So the AI made a move at some point in the winning game that the human experts believe nobody who was a human would have ever made. That it was such a strange move that it got a lot of study, and it was determined that move actually is the thing that set the AI up to win. The AI was able to give a novel solution that ended up improving the outcome in the end. And this creates for us in leadership a fundamental problem with AI. Because there are those systems like the anti-midair collision system that I mentioned in the first session that are super safe. They get a lot of testing. FDA-approved AI tools, a lot of testing, super safe. But most of the AI machine learning tools that we're going to encounter in our life have not been tested to that degree of safety. And they won't be. We should expect that. And so for leaders in an organization, the question is this answer, by the way, this is also you on the internet, not just leaders in the world. The question is this false information that I definitely need to ignore? Or is this something novel that the AI recognizes that we didn't as humans, that I ought to accept, and it could, save lives, better education, identify cure for cancer, whatever. This is the problem. We don't always know. And you can't ask the AIs because it turns out they're not really good at explaining how they got to an answer. And I'm not sure, even if they could explain, it's going to be an answer that's going to be understandable to most of us. I don't know how my toaster works. Right? I don't know how the AI is going to come to the solution. So the idea of explainability It's not always the answer, or sometimes tossed around. And so this is the leadership conundrum for those in AI. And so there's never a world, or there's rarely a world, I should say, in which an AI tool is being used that we shouldn't also be reflecting on it as humans. We have to make a call, and often we won't know the answer. Is this bad information? Is this really very novel information? And you're gonna have to make a judgment call. That's a leadership decision, as much as it is anything else. So AI is not a panacea. This is my bunnies and rainbows, and it is for everybody. But it is, as David flagged, a keystone technology. Okay, final thoughts before takeaways. So, in this series, we've referenced several times, and David did today in his intro, that AI and religion in particular is a keystone technology. I'm going to add democracy to that. See prior lecture if you need to catch up on that. Keystone technologies. What's the feature? 3 features that I think matter most. First of all, they're human-made. Religion's telling us about something, some truths that we think exist, but it's just structure we layer on top of things. At least that's what I was taught in high school. You tell me otherwise, David. AI, just a human-made tool. Faithfully, Godmother, sometimes she's called Godmother, but AI is out there. This week, so there's nothing artificial about AI, it's just human-made. Just another human-made tool. And tools can be used for good or ill. And those decisions are at base in our hands. What leadership principles are we going to exercise and choose in this moment? Okay, final takeaways. With regard to AI, with regard to democracy, and again, Dave will tell us it's really important about our religion too. Maybe he will, if he takes me up on my offer. The movement's moving quickly. Whenever I talk about AI, I always hear folks, look, it's just moving so quickly, and it is. I said this already once, I'm never given the same talk about AI twice in 15 years. There's always something new happening. But you're not alone in this. We're all trying to keep up. And there are people who are engaged in areas you're interested in. So I hope that you'll reach out and lift each other up and engage in, shared peer-to-peer learning, but also read things that are of interest to you. But don't feel overwhelmed in the sense that it immobilizes you. There's a lot happening, but it's also an exciting time. So our real challenges, we've talked about throughout the series, but they're profound opportunities. The ability to save lives, tribes, to transform the way we think about other cultures, to transform the way we learn, to transform the way we experience art, fiction, storytelling. Oh my gosh, there's so much. C session 1. You don't have to, but we do each have a role to play if you're interested. And I hope you will, if you're interested. We do already have a number of useful tools at our disposal. See the ethics conversation. A lot of those things we already have. We've dealt with new technologies before. Most of us in this room lived through the personal computer revolution, the internet revolution, the cell phone revolution. Right? Just start this. Right? I had a turntables. What are we, like 6 generations later now in terms of technologies? We've done this before in many ways. Okay? New things, yes, but you don't need to feel like you're going into this, without tools, without toolkit. Fundamentally, my core belief about people is that we're capable of so much more than we realize. And that we maximize that through the types of conversations, cross-disciplinary work, engagement, value setting, and reaching out that I hope I've underscored, not just tonight, but throughout the series. And then finally, I want to acknowledge, and this is great for a School of Religion setting, I want to acknowledge that the topics of our series, AI, democracy, and religion, they're all imperfect technologies. And the core question for me, as with myself, as with individuals, as with communities, is even acknowledging the imperfections of myself, of the technology, of the community, of the democratic structures, of religious of religious practices and the like, how is it that we are nonetheless going to make the world a better place? That's the leadership question. How is it that we will make the world a better place? It's been a great pleasure to be with you throughout this series. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, John. Grab a drink, get some water. Thank you for a really remarkable reflection and conclusion to thoughts about the series and for your partnership throughout these couple of weeks. So many things in my mind. So in 2020, in the middle of the heaviness of the pandemic, my wife and I were raising teenagers. So at the moment when our kids are trying to self-differentiate from their parents, they're stuck at home, living with us, unable to go anywhere, to attend school, to do anything at all. One particular night, things were getting a little heated at the dinner room, at the dinner table, which we have worked throughout their lives, dinner together every night. And at one point I had to step back and say, the tensions of this nation run right through our dining room table. My children are originally from Ethiopia, so they're growing up in the United States as African-American children. I'm an immigrant to this country, as were my children, but their memory of that is lesser than the way my life has been shaped by being an immigrant. And my wife's family is from Finland, but she also wrestles with the ideas of white privilege in her own life and within her own family. Leadership matters. At the moment, the kind of leadership the country was under in one of its greatest crises was not interested in creating a place or society or community where my family would thrive. It either would force for one part of my family to be successful and not another. It would threaten the lives of my children. And so leadership does matter. One of your questions was, this is an outsized moment for AI, for technology. It is also, I would say, a significantly outsized moment for religious community. But perhaps not in the way we usually think of the demise of traditional religious affiliation, perhaps the limits of free association, not just of religious communities, but of many other forms of clubs and socializing that we do. That is definitely pressing, but I think it's an outsized moment because the reality is that it's much more complex than just the demise of one particular form of how we associate and practice religious traditions, often defined by, in the United States, a predominantly Protestant understanding of religious practice. You go to church, you pray. These are the questions we still ask people to understand the religious practice. We just changed church for mosque or synagogue. It is an outsized moment as we mark the one-year anniversary yesterday of the current conflict in the Middle East and everything that led to that moment, not just the violence of that day and the violence that has destroyed since, but certainly all of the violence that led to that moment of exclusion around forms of leadership and assumptions and claims, often religious, about the nature of society and who around the table will benefit from whatever the well-being of the society is. Thomas Friedman talks in his book about an age of acceleration. The book title is Thank You for Being Late, an optimist's guide to the age of acceleration. He was optimist then. I think he would revise the book today. One of the key things he talks about is that there's been an acceleration of change, and on an exponential way. Globalization has been accelerating, the ability of some people to travel, products to travel, the acceleration of technology, as you said, every 18 months more law, Everything is doubling in speed and is just fast accelerating. And the environmental degradation of the planet has all of a sudden hit this moment that now has us waiting for a second hurricane to hit Florida in nearly as many weeks. As that acceleration is happening, human capacity to adapt is linear. So it creates a massive gap, if you can see that image, right? So this is accelerating, and our ability to adapt is linear. Because as humans, we have historically adapted a little bit at a time. When you introduce a small new technology or a small change, and in those environments, the kind of leadership that was often needed was basically the education and preparation of a small group of leaders who would interpret the change, create the solutions, and teach them to everybody else. So you needed a fairly small group of leaders to understand adaptability and change. In a moment like this, it isn't sufficient. Our educational systems are also in crisis in their inability to train sufficient people to create those adaptations, to understand how to bridge that gap. Our religious practices are undermined in many ways and have lost at times their ability to think of their role. But leadership does matter because religious communities are not in decline and demise everywhere in the country. In fact, one of the challenges is that progressive communities have not considered their role and understanding of religion as an important part of the democratic picture. We have given into the idea that to progress as a human, it eventually leads to abandoning crazy, ancient things like religion. In a way, I've often said, I live not in Berkeley, but I work in Berkeley, that it's interesting in this idea of the development of humans into their better selves. An inevitable idea started in 1976, God is dead, right? That they're going to inevitably become more progressive, more ideal. This is just what will happen. We will shed all these ancient things, and among them religion. But the odd thing again in Berkeley is to say that somehow the best way to be human is to be completely aligned with the values of Berkeley community. And that's the best way to be human. Behind that is the pernicious reality of white supremacy. The sense that there is a way that is better than any other way to be human. And it leads in many ways in this moment of crisis of leadership to having only one candidate holding the Bible upside down because others are not willing to do so as publicly or as clearly out of their ambivalence about how they can be religious, in spite of the fact that most of the other candidates actually practice religious Christians, unlike the one holding the Bible. So leadership does matter. And one of the invitations you're giving us around this is, I think, to think about, so in this gap that needs to be negotiating, what is the function of all these functional technologies? AI can help us to mitigate that gap, to understand how to adapt it. My wife's been in the hospital over the last 2 months several times because of a real complicated pneumonia. So they did 2 scans, 2 CT scans, and of course now, because of technology, you get the results on your phone. Of course, you have no idea what this is, right? But you're the first one to get it even before the doctor can interpret. So what she did is she dumped both the previous one and the current one into ChatGPT and asked the right question. What's different? And could at least, she didn't go on it, didn't start taking medication based on it, but she could get at least an initial interpretation in the moment of concern about what has changed. So this gap can be negotiated by this technology. It can be negotiated by the practices of religious communities that have, as you indicated, a lot of the toolkits and practices that have helped us to navigate previous encounters of bringing fire from hell. Whether it's Prometheus, whether it's our understanding of how writing may have transformed our ways of being. In religious communities, these have been practices and spaces where there has been a rehearsing of how to navigate those distances. Whether that has taken the form in religious communities that formed the early practices of democracy in this country, the meeting house, the place where people began to rehearse how to govern themselves outside of a monarchy. Or religious spaces in many communities of color, particularly African American communities, in which those were the spaces to negotiate how to practice and create a parallel reality for African Americans of business, of health services, of connection in a society that did not have its best interest, their best interest at heart. And so that rehearsal could take place so that when the changes and the availability could become for more access, there was a structure in a community that took place. Religious communities continue to play that role today for many immigrant communities, for whom the religious spaces are the first places where they're able to create agency, organize themselves, create solidarity, retain their cultural traditions. So the forms of leadership that need to be employed to negotiate this gap, I think, is ultimately where our work remains really significant. I really appreciate the important message of saying much of the things we are trying to negotiate, we have negotiated previously. And particularly the critical importance of asking, what is the problem we are trying to solve? What is it that we are trying to resolve? And for AI, that remains a critical question. Whether you're using ChatGPT, the prompt is ultimately where we get to the answer that you're looking for, and it will shape, oftentimes, what responses you get. So, my question to you will be, if you think about this outsized moment and the possibilities and perils of artificial intelligence, what are the ways that you would invite our community here? And I forgot to say, by the way, there are papers by your chairs if you want to write some questions, start putting those together, so that we'll get to your questions very briefly here, but we'll start moving to some questions that are coming from online as well. And we'll actually be beginning tonight with a question from AI, because we really need to do this. So Jacob will be putting that in just a minute. But in this moment, what is the problem you want to solve?
Yeah, I love this. I'm gonna, with your permission, I might start using leadership as a prompt engineering problem, really. But this is, I think that framing is excellent. Because if AI is a tool, as the question, if religion is a tool, if democracy is a tool, what are we aiming for? So my argument over the past 5 years plus in particular has been a rather simple sounding, expand the benefits of AI more broadly so that they're broadly shared, reduce the harms. Okay, that's a thing, that's sort of a mantra that we've got at the Institute for Human-Centered AI at Stanford. And so, you'll often hear me sort of give that simple version, but that's not a simple version when it gets into practice. So caring for immigrant communities, right? That's not, it's easy to say, it's an important principle, it's the right prompt. What are the details? They're highly complex. In the example I gave, the hospital, it's involving the right stakeholders. It's being open to realizing that your design may not be the best design, that you don't have, however elegant your solution is, it may not actually be the one that fits the situation best. It's open to identifying what's the real problem we're trying to solve, not that my experiment goes the way I originally thought, but rather that my tool would actually be used and appreciated and integrated into the practice for the purposes of saving lives. Some of the examples I gave in that first session, the ability of AI to help us be immersed in an educational experience that might help us transform the way we understand another religious community in life. Incredible opportunity there, but what's the prompt? The prompt is not do this really cool thing with AI. The prompt is, trying to reach across time, space, community, understanding for ideally, more beneficial reasons. It could be democratic, it could be community building, it could be organizing, it could be learning, plenty of good reasons. So the simple answer, I think, remains expand the make sure the benefit is broadly shared, reduce the harm, A and B. But every one of those contexts, I think there's 20 different disciplines I flashed up on the AI plus side. Every single one of those needs leaders, whether it's you, whether it's your neighbor, whether it's the students in my class, whether it's students going through the religion programs here at PSR, need people asking, what
is the problem we're solving for, and to remember that fundamentally it's about that purpose, that mission set, that value set first. Honest assessment, identify your values, execute, and it's only a tool. It's whiz bang, it's fun sometimes, but it's a means to an end if we're doing this right. That's what I want to say.
Yeah. Well, I think you mentioned earlier in the conversation, and then again, the importance of restraint, kind of setting some boundaries that guide the decision making, and that's both individual but certainly collective in terms of governance of how we regulate AI. And a lot of you mentioned the fact that right now we are the generation that will set the very significant initial parameters of this age of AI. So a question, as others continue to prepare their questions as well, is that there is a significant divide in the ability to do that regulation and even the resources, not just to utilize AI, but to regulate. Of all the covenants created globally to restrict, international covenants to restrict AI or to guide it, the vast majority of them are only signed on by Northern Hemisphere countries. There's almost no engagement of the Southern Hemisphere on these regulatory processes and international agreements to help to regulate AI. So what can we do?
Yeah,
and I'm asking the question because religiously is the complete reverse, right? The Southern Hemisphere has the most active, engaged religious communities, and because of that, we're also seeing significant rise of extremist forms of religious communities in the South. Oftentimes, out of a desire to have access to the wealth that has been excluded, right? And so then it becomes a way of organizing. Does that make sense? So how do we have excessive AI and regulation and ability in the North and absence in the South? In some ways we could say significant practice of religion, not always extremist, many very powerful and meaningful in the Southern Hemisphere, and an absence of that in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, and then to that, if you were to layer democracy on top of that, you've got large parts of the global South where coups are happening, countries are moving more towards an authoritarian direction and the like, some backsliding in various places as well. So it's just adding to the complexity there.
And there's a significant shift in what you consider the South, Mexico's election of a woman, Guatemala's election of a very progressive leader,
It's a very complex story. Yeah, I think, this has actually been a live question for me over the course of my work, because it would be, Brussels, the EU, it would be the White House, it would be Sacramento, who would come to us and say, hey, to my team, say, hey, help us understand this at that moment. What should we be thinking about in regulation and the like? And when I would ask, hey, look, can we get some the African Union involved? Can we get the OAS involved at the international level? And then can we get ASEAN involved? The answer was, yeah, we will get to them.
Sounds like the response of many denominations in the Christian tradition, but yes, well.
So firstly, I think there's, for the teams that are out there actively trying to educate policymakers and help organize thinking around safety and regulation, there's, the response would be not surprising to many of you. Yeah, but this is, Europe and North America where the technologies are being built, so we need to regulate there first. That is not my view. That was not my view and continues not to be. And in fact, it ended up being really important when we would engage with countries beyond North America and Europe, where we would have a couple of types of engagement on the leadership front. One, there are the policymakers that are always interested in learning more. There's data privacy questions, there's questions of data colonialism. Some of you have talked with me about that over the past couple of weeks off camera. There are questions around governance. What are the best leadership groups to be talking to in particular countries? So one example I often highlight is our work with UNICEF. UNICEF has a lot of things that it's trying to do with its AI projects. One of them is to help countries that don't have a strong governance structure at the legal, political level, identify basic infrastructure, like where the wells are, where people go to get their hospital or their medical care, so the local clinics, where the schools are. For many of us in the United States or in, in wealthier countries, it's presumed that we can look it up online or find some other place there. But what we find is it's even as basic as, can AI help us solve where people are getting their food and water from, and then going in and finding that the way their data is structured or the way the data is organized gives really unhelpful answers out of the AI world. And so on one hand, we're looking at solving problems that are extra complicated in this context, but are problems that we want to try and solve, because if you know where the infrastructure is, you can then lead charities, you can then lead government agencies, you can then just distribute COVID vaccines, etc. And then on the other hand, there's real concerns that, hey, look, is this just the next era of colonialization where Europe and North America are coming in with their fancy tools and sucking up all of our data and then siphoning them off?
Well, that goes back to the fact that, the issues around the ethics questions are very similar, not just about this technology or perennial issues that we are already sort of wrestling with, and provides the opportunity for religious communities that have been wrestling with a shift of a very missionary approach that is from the north to the south, to try to explore and experiment with different ways of understanding how governance and wisdom may come from a much more diversified set of places globally, and wisdom and understanding particularly about how communities are being restructured and reconnected. We are pondering and thinking about that in religious communities, trying to understand what is happening elsewhere in the world that may help inform the way we think about the preparation of leaders or the practice of religious traditions here. So a similar pattern about understanding, what might inform the way we think about technology. So we'll turn to some of the questions online and to continue our conversation. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, you can put them in the chat if you're online. Otherwise, you can pass them down. And we will be quick and we'll try our best to get to as many questions as we can. The first one is generated by AI. And so you can see here the prompt that it was, we basically uploaded everything that we've been saying over the last 3 days and over the last 3 sessions, and had AI ask the first question. So with AI increasingly taking roles in decision making and community building, how do you see the future of spiritual leadership evolving in a world where machines might influence people's beliefs and behaviors more than human leaders? All right, that's for you.
The softball question, eh? Yeah. So you're not surprised probably at this point in the series that I'm going to say something along the lines of, the technologies are going to help us think differently and engage differently on a variety of fronts. And yet, and if you go back to the first session, I flagged that I can imagine a world in which AI is thought of as our oracles and really thinking about, them as the new spiritual leader, the new God on high, behind, the new burning bush, or whatever your preferred analogy is. That's probably a world we should, prepare for. And yet, I haven't seen anything that's killed off religion yet, no matter what the technology is. And so I agree with that reason in the world that religious communities will continue to be essential, both in the human leaders shaping beliefs and the like, but also, real recognition that the technologies that we hold, that we utilize, do impact the way we engage in the world. So whether it's shorter attention spans, as Dean Abraham mentioned, and the like, what's that going to mean as AI gets more and more diffuse? Well, it may not matter that I can find my dog really quickly, through my AI-powered search engine on my phone anymore. That may have less of an impact, but how it is that I envision that, how it is that I tell stories, how it is that we create stories. And as much as we rely on AI to help us think creatively on those fronts, you can see a lot of possibilities from it being really helpful for us, thinking critically to...
Yeah, and to the extent that AI learns from what's already existing, right? One of the things in the pandemic that happened is that all of a sudden you have sermons from all over the world recorded. We have the largest cache of religious stuff ever. And it's distributedly produced. It's not centralized the library. It's really everywhere. And so to the extent that I can learn to speak, to think, and to be informed in a much more complex way, that's helpful. But it also speaks to the importance of religious leadership engaging at all levels, not just in a seminary setting, but in a congregational setting with the technologies, in order to utilize the technologies to advance that. So, what's the next question from AI? So, from a theological standpoint, see that we're more interested in the religion questions, you notice that? I think AI is trying to figure this out. So from a theological standpoint, how should we approach the tension between democracy, which values human agency and participation, and AI systems that could predict or control outcomes, potentially undermining free will? The questions we've been thinking about for a long time. Free will.
Free will. It says from a theological perspective. Do you want this one?
Sure, I'll start. So, part of it is earlier I thought I had to at some point talk about the Matrix. This is the chance, right? So you all may have seen the movie The Matrix, right? So everybody knows the red pill, the green pill, right? It's a very Gnostic story, right? In Gnostic traditions throughout human history, there's always part of the tradition that has certain knowledge nobody else does. And the moment you get that knowledge, you take the pill, you can see the world in a way that nobody else is seeing it, right? So I think that part of the question of the movie, The Matrix, is the idea as to whether humans really have any agency at all. Are we really just in a virtual reality? So part of the response to that is that all reality is virtual, right? When I look at you all, it's virtual. Like, what I see is not who you are. I can hardly understand your brains, your minds, everybody else's. Does that make sense? I am constructing an understanding of what I view in my brain in some way. So all reality is constructed in some ways through the minds that we have, and we interpret it and shape it. So free will has always been, this is a struggle of many religious traditions, a good reason to go to seminary, is to study all the way that humans have significantly tried to understand to what extent we do have any kind of free will. How much of what we perceive and see has been nurtured into us, shaped into us, and then what is our ability to make that one infinitesimal decision. So AI just simply, I think, introduces yet another set of information that will shape that process. And it really calls for the need for religious practices that ultimately help us to ground ourselves more significantly. It's not incidental that there's a rise in the recognition of the need to breathe, to do some yoga, to break away from some of the things so that we can step back. And what the psalmist said, be still and know.
For me, it comes down to, I think, my fundamental belief about what AI is going to do in society. So sort of the one tagline. Some of you in the Q&As afterwards have indicated, hey, you're pretty optimistic about it. I don't know that I'm optimistic. Last time I tried to make the argument more down the middle. But here is where I stand fundamentally. And I think that artificial intelligence is fundamentally unleashing a powerful moment of human creativity. And human creativity exists in many forms and takes the form of good and ill. So the age of AI is fundamentally an unleashing of human creativity for good and for ill.
Prometheus has run down the fire. What are we going to make of it, right? All right. What questions do we have from the audience? So Governor Newsom just vetoed a plan for guardrails around the creation of AI. This is the problem that business practices looking to maximize profit is creating the conditions for dangerous AI. You didn't solve this last week, so you get to this week.
Yeah, great. Yeah, earlier in the series, we didn't know how he was going to vote on this. That particular piece of legislation, as many of you know, was, I think, well reported, certainly here in California, divided a lot of members of the AI community, including a lot of members of the AI safety community. I didn't take a hard stand on it. So, you know, I'm not going to fight, and now we know the outcome. But we're going to have to live with the impact of it not providing constraints around large AI models. And so see earlier comments about leadership. In a field in which much is permitted, much is possible, you know, when I talk to business leaders, it's exactly that point. I expect that regulation may not be coming. For business leaders, for technologists, for users like us, or many of the rest of us, fundamentally, this is what are we going to do with that freedom? That is a leadership question.
And I think, it's also just a spiritual practice, right? The ascetics understood that you have to say yes to some things. Rather, you have to say no to some things in order to say yes to others. You might fast in order to focus. You might exercise a self-restraint in order to be able to create another opportunity. And so those practices we need to rehearse again and then apply into this new age in the college. The question of profit, though, remains really critical, right? And I think that we have to think seriously. A lot of our work here at PSR, and I think in many ways that the set of communities that are here, committed to education for social change here on Scully Hill, our commitment is to understanding that there are legacies of colonialism that are extractive, right? You've already addressed in part of the question that AI can become extractive of knowledge and basically, bring it all out. A lot of practices of colonial powers are extractive. You go into a community, you extract the prime matter and the power, and you make money out of that. So a lot of it is the discipline that it will take is that we need to be quite intentional in our democratic practices to ensure that we are challenging ways that we do not simply replicate through this technology a new era of colonial practices and extraction. And currently, that's the way it's going, right? It's going to require a significant engagement from democratic forces, from religious forces, and from others to practice a different aesthetic approach to this. So our next question. Leadership requires synthesizing pertinent information. If AI does most of the tedious or hard work for us, won't this affect the quality of leadership? I think last week, was it Professor McMahon who said, the poets aren't going to get all that creative if they're not doing the dishes.
Yeah, I love this question. Okay, so there are a few answers to this that other folks give. And so, one is the calculator analogy you probably heard when ChatGPT came out. Hey, look, if students no longer have to do the math by longhand, but they get the quick answers from a calculator. Did they stop learning math? No, they learned math differently. They were freed up to learn the higher skills earlier, right? This is the refrain that we get. I think it's reasonable. It's a reasonable answer here, and I want to acknowledge the concern that I think is underlying here, that there is hard work, there is refinement in expertise. So in this case, in leadership, but in a lot of areas of expertise that requires the reps, requires some of that hard work along the way. And so I do think there's a legitimate concern here going forward. And so for those of us in education, at all parts of the leadership cycle, in my case, this is a real challenge for me to make sure that as expert systems, this piece of the AI puzzle that we talk about that are going to help leaders make good decisions based on good data, based on better qualities than ChatGPT will, that there's a different set of leadership skills that are going to be needed. And I think right now, actually a large part of my work right now is trying to identify how are we going to be refining our curriculum over the next 3 years to account for those differences going ahead. So again, I think we've been through this in one sense on the calculator side, or that response set that we often hear, and I think there really is some rethink about what those differences now should look like. I gave a couple of gestures probably in the list, in today's presentation here, and some of those we do incorporate in our work and in my work across my various teams. But I don't think I've got my list complete yet, and so these are the types of conversations that I'm excited to keep having.
In one of the faculty meetings earlier last spring here at PSR, we started out this discussion, and that is to read Plato's dialogue. So there's one of Plato's dialogues of the introduction of writing. If you may be familiar, Plato wrote much of Aristotle's thinking, but Aristotle actually didn't believe in writing. He thought it would make people dumb, right? Because then they would remember it and he had serious concerns. So in the dialogues, Plato actually captures this by the story of this person who introduces from the gods writing to the king of Egypt. The king of Egypt then starts to identify some of the problems. People will become dumb, they're not going to have to remember anything, and you're not going to know the validity of knowledge because you're just reading it in the absence of the person who wrote it, so you can interpret whatever the heck you want into. So these are interesting conversations that we can continue to think about how are we going to intentionally create educational programs that engage the current level of technological reality, the current version of the fire that's being used. So many of the examples you gave of good applications of AI were in highly regulated spaces, but you mentioned that many machine learning tools we interact with won't be tested. How do we cut out our regulatory testing systems?
Yeah, I think this is, I love the question because I think it makes a great, it makes a gesture to a really important set of the technology. So in those highly regulated areas, you're going to have a lot of oversight, fine, reasonable. I could talk more about that, but I don't think that's the part of this question here. It's in those unregulated spaces. It's not that a lot of those AI tools won't be tested, but they won't be tested to levels of accuracy or other measures. So anti-bias, current information, best medical practices. There'll be a lot of things out in the wild that we're going to have to navigate. Is that terribly different from a lot of things that are in those unregulated areas right now? As we hear a lot of ideas, and I see a lot of things in my online ad, digital ad world there that I got a lot of questions about less regulated space. I'm less worried about it when I'm going to my pharmacist, right, and getting a drug from them, more regulated space. So, already in our daily lives, we deal with a fair amount of this variance. You can imagine free speech, problem with mis and disinformation. We see a lot of that already. A lot of the AI, am I engaging with an AI tool that has been tested, that I have good trust in? Maybe so, if WebMD develops a better system, for their outputs, versus, if I'm just engaging in the generic, fun PAL AI that, I'm supposed to buddy up with because it's a good, fun companion, but it's not tested towards safety. We deal with that already. So I think I love the reminder that there's not one singular AI out there again. We're going to have a lot of different areas and places where you're going to feel more comfortable, more safe, have a lot more confidence, and good reason to feel that way. And then you're going to have a lot of places where we're going to deal with crap, as we do today.
Yeah, and I think the opportunity here again is that oftentimes, of course, the question is about a centralized regulatory system. Right? The government, the state, government regulate. Part of what we need to, the opportunity we have at this moment and the need we have at this moment is to rely on much more distributed efforts. That where regulatory efforts are made all over the place, not just in but also in the private sector, in religious communities, and also to be able to identify and engage with the questions and try to find solutions to the problems much more distributed all over. And then from that crowdsource, what are the regulations or the practices, either by mouthing some systems or by praising others, right? But all right,
I will just mention there are teams actively engaged in this process for the major models that are out there right now in the sphere. So the Stanford Center for the Study of Foundation Models, I'm missing the word there, CRFM is their analogy, but they're doing a project called Helm, in which they are on various types of metrics, accuracy, bias, and the like, that are out there. And we should expect that we'll have scoring systems proliferate soon in the next few years. So we'll have some help along the way too.
This question was in my head earlier in the conversation, so we all have heard the refrain that guns don't kill people, people do. AI is being used by Christian nationalists to undermine democracy. Why give such a tool to people?
Love this question. Why did I give some pen and paper? Yeah, I think this is exactly the tool analogy I want to emphasize here. It's just the next along the line. From newspapers to copy to internet to listservs to mail at home. In the second lecture with Dean Abraham, I emphasized the speed, right? The accessibility, the lowering the bar of cost. I think those are the changes in degree and access that are, more what AI gives us access to in a way that the ability to distribute all kinds of things on the Christian nationalist front has long been available through a variety of technologies as well. So speed, access, and the like are critical. I'm not sure that AI
fundamentally changes the core. I could be wrong on that, by the way. Convince me otherwise, but I think that's where I am today.
Malcolm Harris published a recently entitled Palo Alto, the History of California, Capitalism, and Everything Else. And it's a really interesting take on the development of California as the home of engineering, really. But his critique is the fact that much of that spirit of break it, move fast, break things, came out of mining, right? So mining shifted the way we engaged nature, right? We went from the panning for gold of the 49ers to this very extractive, very disruptive, large engineering hydraulic systems that began to have no regard for the earth, right? Just plow through and destroy. So I do think that the question does call on us in our various leadership capacities, both as communities, as democratically engaged people, as religious people, to call for the care of the way we relate. We suffer as a society, our environment has, by the loss of practices that really are much more attentive to relationality, to that, what Dean Abraham talked about, a covenantal relationship, not just to each other, but to the planet, to our communities. So I do think that this is an important area of the practice of religious traditions and other democratic systems. This is the last question. How are we framing AI within a Western viewpoint, and how might that be problematic?
Good. I love this question. Okay, so yeah, this is great. So this is actually a question that I don't have great answers for. What I'll tell you is my last project for leading Stanford for Berkeley. We can do that around here. Brett was on. Was exactly this: was convening civic leaders and government leaders from around the world, outside of Europe and North America, who we had heard a lot from, seeing earlier comments, and asking, how is it that you're viewing AI? How should we be rethinking it? And really sitting at the feet of their mastery of AI. That project was ongoing, and I haven't seen the final report, but I'll tell you I'll give one example very early on, and this was from our training of Maria Ressa's team, so Nobel Peace Prize winner on journalists out of the Philippines. And she basically said, all the optimism around AI is not anything that we're seeing. What we see AI is fundamentally oppressive in the hands of an authoritarian government, an anti-democratic government. And so, starting point, one example early in that research was not overly, encouraging. I gave the Unisat example as, which could be used as a counter example here to say, and yet even in those, non-Western contexts or non-majoritarian Western contexts, AI has the potential to really do some good work on the humanitarian fronts anyway. But I think initial responses there were there's a fundamental difference. There are fundamental differences. I don't think in the U.S. we've done a good job of collecting those. I think it's a space that that I'd like to see the AI community focusing more, made some initial steps, and other folks are carrying that out right now.
I think we are living in an increasingly multipolar world. So even this question, the part of it is what's happening in India in the development of AI, what's happening in China. And we are framing the rise of other forms and other spaces in this race for AI in the same way that we have other races, military and otherwise, with fear about anybody else having access to anything else. And so I think this question challenges us to think about how do we create a more multipolar world in which there isn't a single power that sees itself as the primary police, the practice and the one to be trusted with the use of certain technologies, whether there be weapons or artificial intelligence, but rather to develop the capacity, the learning, the access, and some of the things we highlighted earlier about making it more accessible are really critical. At PSR, we make a commitment to students at orientation, and oftentimes those who are students get a little tired of hearing it, to do three things: to blow your mind, to embolden your heart, and to strengthen your hands. But our educational experiences, whether they're 1-hour conversations or a 3-year degree, will help you blow your mind and frame the things you care deeply about into a much larger whole. Religious traditions, theological education are at their best attentive to that larger whole, which the ancient ones have called the mind. To embolden our hearts, we are living through a time of deep disorientation, and so it is significant that we draw on our traditions and our communities, on our cross-disciplinary approaches, to figure out the practices that help us to draw from a deeper well, and to develop the kind of leadership that encourages us to do that personally, but also to facilitate that process in the communities we are part of, in the democratic practices we engage in. And finally, to strengthen our hands, to develop the necessary skills through our educational programs and our conversations to lead in a world where we can bring about the kind of vision we hope for the world. So I think you will agree with me that John has helped to blow our minds, embolden our hearts, and strengthen our hands in these conversations over the last couple of days. So please join me in giving thanks to John again. I also want to thank Dean Susan Abraham and Professor Leonard McMahon for their participation and leadership in this session. This series would not be absolutely possible at all without the incredible dedication of a great team of folks here at PSR, from our facility staff that has set up the space, for facilities and folks in development, to community life, to participating in many ways. And I can name lots of folks. I do want to invite 2 of them to stand up for us tonight, Michelle Estrellado and participate in that. So thank you to our communications team and Matthew over here, Jacob over there, and many others here at PSR who have helped us to make this possible tonight. And especially to those of you who support the work of PSR. Whether you're a board or trustee member, donor, alum of PSR, we're grateful for the ways that you make our work possible and encourage you to continue to support the work of PSR. Thank you very much. If this is the first time you've been in our community, please come back. If you're here often, come more often. Thank you. Have a good day.